This lesson focuses on the Chicano movement. However, I am going to be addressing this idea of the bigger picture to give you context as to where the Chicano movement comes from. I'm also going to have you all do an activity that I typically do in the face-to-face class because I could sit here and lecture every single organization that came out of the Chicano movement, but that would take forever for one. But then also, I think if you engage with the material, you'll be able to understand some of the kind of major aspects of these different organizations that existed during this particular period. So keep that in mind. I'll be talking about general American history and then put the Chicano movement within that spectrum. All right. So I start off looking at this cartoon right here that kind of says, whatever happened to old liberalism? And so we're going to look at the rise of Chicanismo from the 60s to 1975. And this is what Chicano historians have labeled the Chicano generation, right? So we've been talking about the immigrant generation, I guess the conquered generation, immigrant generation, Mexican-American generation, and now we're going to focus on the Chicano generation. And what we see here is, it's kind of a funny cartoon because basically what was once considered old liberalism is now called conservatism. So, well, actually today I don't know with the current president because there's really no conservatism there. I don't know what it is. I think everybody's kind of puzzled by it too. But conservatism before 2016 kind of mimics some of these ideas. If you ever take a political science class, they could probably dig deeper into that. But we're going to be looking at what's called Neoliberalism. Okay. So, like I said, before I get into the Chicano movement, I'll be talking about the what's happening in America in the 1950s. So the last lesson kind of ended with World War II. We're kind of jumping a few decades, right, to the 1960s when we're focusing on Mexican Americans. But let's talk about the 1950s in general American history. And there's a few changes that are taking place. Number one, after the war, remember in the 1930s, America's in the Great Depression, and early 40s, we're going through a war, so everything's being rationed out. But after 1945, there's this sense of prosperity. You do have a few recessions here and there, but for the most part, things are improving in regards to opportunities for some people. Right, so Americans are buying. The Americans are moving to the suburbs. They got some cash in their pocket. They got cars, and a lot of people have kind of looked back to the 1950s as this kind of ideal period. Hence, words like "Make America Great Again." Right, it's supposed to take us back to this kind of nostalgic, Back to the Future, 1950s poodle skirts and milkshake bars and that kind of whole ideal. But when you look at the 1950s, they seem to have all the material wealth, but then people kind of go, are they even happy, right? So if you watch a show like Mad Men, or if you watch a movie like Revolutionary Road, here you have a bunch of white Americans that have everything and they're so miserable, and it's not far from the truth, right? So that's why it's so funny when people say "Make America Great Again." It's like, oh, who wants to go back to that period, right? And for minorities, it's even worse, right? Because we're not even welcome to participate in any of that. So you have Americans, and the 1950s. This does represent this kind of idea of excess, right? I mean, if you look at a car like this, I think it's like a '59 Impala. And, at this time, cars are, have all this chrome, that's, these kind of crazy wings. Part of it's design, but it's also indicative of how much resources we have as a nation, that we can all of a sudden move from a car that that moves you from point A to point B to having all these kind of luxuries. Some of the inside components, they have power windows, they have makeup kit, not makeup kits, but places where you put your makeup in the car, right? It's just ridiculous how much wealth we have that we can produce such great objects, right? I mean, I guess we still kind of see that today. We want cars to drive themselves because for whatever reason, we got too lazy of driving. So it's just kind of interesting. And Americans begin to move to the suburbs, and the suburbs kind of emulate that idea of excessness, right? I mean, today, Arizona, most of you probably live in some kind of suburb in Arizona, or if not community, that used to be a suburb. And you have all these houses that kind of look alike. They have their nice little green yards and, the cul-de-sacs and, their 3-bedroom homes and things like that. And the thing is that the people that are moving to the suburbs are not minorities. It's white Americans that are moving from the cities into the suburbs, right? And at this time, they actually have laws against minorities moving into these suburbs. So there's different ways to kind of stop minorities from moving into these places. Some of it has to do with real estate agents not showing them the houses there. Other places, you have housing communities that have it in their laws that say no minorities can move here, particularly African Americans, but Mexican Americans are also part of that group, that excluded group. So we tend to live in the urban centers, obviously places like East Los Angeles and Segundo Barrio and El Paso, right? We're kind of restricted in certain housing areas. So we have Mexicans moving, if some of them have been there forever, but they live in the urban centers, while white Americans who tend to have better schools, right, better communities and so forth. So they're not allowed to move into these places, and a lot of it has to do with the perception of these minority groups. They bring, according to white Americans at this time, they bring in crime, they're dirty, they don't take care of themselves and the community and so forth, right? So there's a lot of discrimination happening there. And another reason too is that it's just too damn expensive, right? Mexicans, unfortunately, are not paid enough to move into these middle class neighborhoods also. So there's a few studies out there that say that Mexican Americans made about 40 cents to the Anglo dollar, right? So while an American, like white American, will make $1, Mexican Americans on average will make only 47 cents to that $1 that an Anglo-American would make. So it's going to take you, double the time to make as much money as an Anglo-American, right? You have to work twice as hard, right? Things that we've heard our entire lives sometimes, right? And as I mentioned earlier, right? Mexican Americans lived in kind of horrible housing, places like Chavez Ravine or East LA. They had limited economic opportunities. They like I think I mentioned during World War II, they tend to get fired from the good paying jobs. They tend to go to the worst schools during this period. So, college is not even much of a thought for many of them. It's actually, some do tend to go because, and only because of the GI Bill, where they get, the college paid for because of their military service. So that's part of the reasons why you have Mexican American teachers during this period, because some of them go to college, get their degrees, and go back into the neighborhoods and are able to teach in these areas. So that's what's kind of happening, right? Middle class America is moving to the suburbs. They have all this stuff. They can buy whatever they want for the most part, and they're miserable. And again, many studies kind of showcase this. Sorry. And what we find is that in the 1950s, you have this kind of movement, particularly a youth movement, that begins to question this. Now, parents during the 1950s, particularly white American parents, grew up in the Great Depression where they had nothing, right? So a lot of times it's them kind of compensating, trying to give their kids everything. However, kids growing up in the 1950s, some of them, they feel like, mom and dad, keep on giving me all this stuff, but I don't need any of this stuff, right? What they really are looking for is love. And a lot of times Americans, particularly men, we associate, gifts with love, right? Well, I gave you this, why are you complaining, right? That kind of mentality. Now, I know I say this kind of jokingly, but you see it in their movies. If you ever seen the movie Rebel Without a Cause, it's James Dean that just feels completely alienated by, this kind of consumer culture. And in the story, in the movie, there's a scene where his father kind of tries to understand his son, James Dean here, and says, what's wrong? Don't I give you everything? And then it's that idea of love. He says, I don't want any of this stuff, right? I just want to spend time with you, Dad, type of mentality. So really, that the notion here is that materialism does not bring happiness for even white Americans, and they're doing well, right? And you see it in movies, but you also see it in writers. Jack Kerouac, he writes the book On the Road. He's part of this what's called a Beat Generation, and they began to kind of question this not only the idea of consumerism, but this middle class identity, right? This notion that let's move to the suburbs and the hell with the rest of the world, because many of these kids are seeing what's happening around them, right? They have all these opportunities, yet African Americans can't go into certain places. They have, what's called a green book, where they have to, it's this basically like a guide telling them where they can stay, where they can eat because of segregation, right? And for this youth who grows up listening to jazz music and, white artists who basically co-op black culture, right? They begin to kind of realize that there's something wrong with the system, quite clearly. So they begin to reject that middle class standing. Now, by the 1960s, you also, again, looking at the big picture of America as a whole, you see this idea of neoliberalism, where the government begins to take an active role in addressing the problems of capitalism. So, yes, you have a growing middle class in the 1950s. A lot of it has to do with the unions, right? Unions did a lot of great things for many white Americans. But people in general are saying, look, well, we have things, but what about all this poverty that we have? There's a book called The Other Side, I think. I want to say The Other Side. Anyways, it talks about poverty in America, where, people like, kids who follow the fields who have nothing, right? There's a lot of poor whites in America. Just go to Virginia, right? To West Virginia, and you'll see it. Sorry. And you have people like JFK, who begins to implement particularly economic policy to try to hope that it kind of trickles down to the masses, particularly the poor, and it would help them get out of the lower class. In addition, for many Mexican Americans, they are attracted to JFK partly because he's young, right? He's not like an old fuddy-duddy like Nixon, who was running at that time. So many Mexican Americans relate to that experience, particularly a youthful generation. And he's Catholic, the first Catholic president. And for many Mexicans, he's like, hey, this is our guy, right? There's that kind of connection. What's her name? His wife, Jacqueline Kennedy, actually made some videos to attract the Mexican American community as a voting bloc. She made commercials in Spanish. So it felt like for the first time, a presidential candidate was addressing them specifically, right? A lot of times when we look at the president candidates, like, well, what do we care? They're only catering to white America or the rich people or something like that. But for this particular example, it almost felt like he was talking to us. And JFK tried to do some things. Unfortunately, he got killed at 3 years into his presidency in '63 in November, and that torch was carried by LBJ. And I mentioned earlier the relationship that LBJ had with Mexican Americans. And here you see LBJ as a teacher teaching all these young Mexican American kids, right? So he had that strong relationship with them. And for JFK as a whole, he created a program called the Great Society, this notion that we can actually end poverty, not just for Mexican Americans, but for everybody. And it really kind of carried that spirit of JFK. He also implemented, voting rights laws, and he tried to do so much that it really kind of changed America. Like, wow, we can actually make a difference and kind of help people. So when it comes to the Chicano movement is influenced by the world around them. They're not operating in a vacuum here, right? They see what's happening outside of their community that shapes the Chicano movement. we see with the Black Lives Matter movement, right? That this idea of, there's all these things happening in America, and obviously the death of Floyd really kind of sparked something. But sometimes there's also external factors that shape it too, where they're addressing not just the killing of cops, but income inequality and I'm sure there's gender issues and all these other things that just kind of that was just a spark of something much bigger. So what kind of gave rise to the Chicano movement? Number one is the war on poverty. This kind of movement from the White House that's saying we can end poverty, and obviously Mexican Americans are influenced by that because a lot of us are poor. We also notice the African American movement, right? You have Martin Luther King, you have Malcolm X, but you have other movements that predate this period. Again, there's a lot of civil rights movement happening in the 1950s, particularly within the Communist Party and African Americans and so forth. So this also kind of opens our eyes that, we need to do something. They're doing something, right? We could do something too. The white student movements, as I said earlier, this kind of white youth, that alienated culture feels that more should be done. And you have white movements, right? White student movements, not like white power movements, okay? But white student movements, such as at Berkeley, at the different universities, the student, SDS, Student for Democratic Society, kind of advocating for political participation and addressing some of the civil rights issues that many other groups are addressing too. So it's not just happening in the African American community, it's happening everywhere. It's almost like there's a wave happening that we kind of sense, and it's like, oh man, we need to start riding this wave. And as I mentioned earlier, right, the sense of youth alienation, obviously drugs become important, making people question this middle class life, and there's nothing wrong with middle class life. I live in the suburbs, and it's depressing as hell. And for many of us, when we move out here, we kind of go, wow, we made it, and it's nice, but there's no action happening over here in the suburbs, and there's, I don't know, it almost feels like there's no purpose out here, but it's nice, it's kind of safe, I guess. But you want more. You feel like you can do more, particularly when you come from a generation that was very politically active in the 30s and 40s. A good example is Betty Friedan. If you ever read, what's her book? She's the one that starts the feminist movement in the 1960s, the feminine mystique. And, she writes about being a housewife and how boring that is, and basically makes her depressed. Now, understand that before she became a housewife, in the 1930s and 40s, she was very politically progressive. So she went from being in college and participating in all these movements to all of a sudden being stuck at home, right? So there's this, and being home, I know someone was like, God, I wish I could take a day off from work. Yeah, that's great, but just being home is boring. You have no meaning in life. So this kind of new youth is kind of addressing this, like, we can do something, right? We can put this alienation to work and create a better society. So those are external factors. These are factors that are happening outside the Chicano community that kind of influence us, that we're kind of watching here and there. But there's also internal factors. So that's within our community, right? For the Chicano movement, even though we kind of always present it as the apex of Chicano history, we have to remember that there are other movements that predate the Chicano movement. That's why I always kind of make fun of this idea that the only Mexican we know is Cesar Chavez, right? Because that's the only one we're taught when we take a typical American history course. But throughout the course, I've been telling you about Per Corona, about Tenayuca, about all these other movements like Las Coras Blancas that happened before 1960s and Cesar Chavez. So it's been a continuous fight for civil rights within our community that predate the 1960s. So it's not like one day we just say, hey, African Americans are doing it, we're going to do it too. No, we've always been doing it. And it's a generation that says, something, America does not accept us, at least the way we are, right? They want to make us into them. And enough is enough. If you remember, Mexican Americans, buying bleaching creams, trying to look white, right? Americanization programs telling them that they're dirty, to act more white, to let go of their culture because that's what's holding them back. And for many Americans, that's bullshit. Again, and it's organizations such as LULAC who kind of promote this sense like, oh, look, let's try to appease white people. And this Chicano generation says, no, enough is enough. We're going to be who we are because we are proud of our people, right? Of our past, particularly our indigenous past. So they reject this notion that in order to succeed in America, you need to act white. And they're saying, no, we can be who we are. My hair is beautiful. My skin is beautiful. Our culture has value. And it's held us together for generation after generation. So they reject this notion that we have to let go of our culture. And they believe in self-determination. We're not going to wait for the government to give us stuff. We're going to demand it, and we're going to seek it out, and we're going to get it. And you have this kind of uplifting message of activism in the Mexican American community, where they're advocating, for courses like this, like Chicano studies, and unfortunately, right now, we have this push to kind of eliminate these type of programs, and it's horrific, just because some person is losing the fight in politics. Why should we have to give up what's ours and our history and our culture? So we definitely see how Chicanos have had enough, and they challenge that idea that we're not going to be passive, we're going to be active agents to create real social change. And also, this is an educated generation. As I mentioned earlier, when Bert Corona went to college at USC in the 1930s, there's only one other Mexican there, maybe. And then the rest of them were a bunch of rich white kids from Latin America. But in the 1940s, particularly after World War II and the GI Bill, you begin to see more Mexican Americans entering college. But in the 1960s, a lot more begin to go. It's still, it's not a huge amount. It's a small percentage. Maybe no more than 5% at this time, but still there's more brown faces at the different universities. I remember talking to one person, he's a Chicano activist back in the 60s. He's like, there weren't many, and the Mexicans that I encountered at college, he was at UC Santa Barbara, he said, they were the janitors, so I used to go hang out with the janitors because they were my people, so there weren't many, but you do begin to see a lot more. And like I said earlier, people like Sal Castro get the GI Bill. He becomes a teacher, goes into the barrio, and starts educating them and making them feel proud of who they are, right? That they don't need to be ashamed of being Mexican. Mexican is not a bad word. So this really begins to shape Mexican American politics and obviously history too, my program. Mexican Americans begin to use this new kind of lens when we look at history. Mexican Americans say, we are U.S. citizens, but like many colonies that Europeans have held or America has held, like Puerto Rico and Hawaii and so forth, we are an internal colony. Right? So again, as I mentioned in the previous lesson, that Americans don't see themselves as colonizers. We don't like to think of ourselves that way, but we are. The West, the Southwest was colonized by the Americans through a fictitious war, right? That was propagated by Polk. So they begin to say we are an internal colony, right? So they begin to challenge that kind of black-white dichotomy that only African Americans face discrimination. Obviously they do, but also add to that Mexican Americans and other groups too, because you also see Asian American movement, Native American movement, women's movement, right? Gay rights movement happening here. And at this time, it's presented as an us versus them. Today it's completely changed, but definitely, right, that Mexican Americans have been viewed as second-class citizens. And a lot of it has to do with American policy. And they begin to kind of challenge this notion of American democracy that, well, maybe democracy exists here, but America needs to understand that our foreign policy impacts migration, right? The way we relate to, Latin American countries shapes migration over here. As I mentioned during the Mexican-American Revolution, it was all American corporations going to Mexico, basically taking land from poor Mexicans, which caused these people off their land and then caused them to migrate over here. So, like I said earlier, nothing operates out of a vacuum. If you want to stop immigration, stop stealing other people's land, right? Whether it be as a country or as corporations. So they become very critical of certain government policies that impact Latin American countries. So we see these movements such as Che Guevara. So you might agree with Che Guevara or you might not. But, you know, for many Chicanos in the 1960s, this is a David and Goliath story where David, represented by Che, is fighting against this big imperialist country. And, they're successful, which they might not completely agree with his tactics or even politics, but at the very least, it showed that you can challenge the powers that be at this time. It's these kind of Western nations who kind of dominate Cuba, right? So many Chicanos look up to people like Che Guevara at this time. And one of the most kind of significant books that comes out is this book by, it's a historian. I think he might have retired. Rodolfo Acuña writes a book called Occupied America. The title itself tells you, right, who we are. And it talks about Mexican American history in the Southwest, not as welcomed citizens, as the Trio de Guadalupe Hidalgo articulated, but as a colonized people, right? And again, he writes this history book, and for many Chicanos, this is a very groundbreaking text that tells us our history as to how we're part of this idea called America. And it's not as equal citizens, right? It's as a dominated group, as a conquered group. And a lot of people say, well, it's such a negative history, or if you don't like America, get the hell out. It's like, and Acuña says, this is our country, right? We were in the Southwest. So if I go back, I have to go back to California because, this was once Mexico, it wasn't the United States, it was once Mexico. So it's very critical of the United States, but, for many Chicanos, it's a very powerful book. All right, so what do we learn? Number one, that, this kind of movement's happening across the United States. It's Americans, even white Americans, are kind of questioning, that material culture of the 1950s. Is buying stuff does it make you happy? And I think those of us who are poor sometimes think, well, it does. If I didn't have to work as much, or if I had a car, if I had a house, right? And maybe there's some element of truth to it that, at the very least you get some temporary relief. But I think for the most part have found out that, buying stuff does not make you happy, right? At least not in the long term. And white America kind of realizes that in the 1950s. And for many, again, Americans, white Americans, African Americans, Asian Americans, Chicanos, they begin to question this concept of American being special. It might be special for some if you're a white male, middle class and upper class person, then yeah, the world's your oyster. But for everybody else, it's not. Even women who have it, have a lot of stuff. They're like I said, very depressed during the 1950s. Hence the feminist movement. And for many Chicanos, whereas the 1950s really kind of focuses on class as the main issue, because, they're working alongside with Anglo-Americans and African-Americans, and they're all poor, right? And sometimes they fight together in these unions and these protests as a collective. But in the 1950s, they begin to leave these kind of jobs, right? These kind of industrial jobs. They become more professional. They move to the suburbs, and they leave everybody else behind, right? So, for many of them, in the 1960s, race becomes a kind of determining factor, where they begin to focus no longer as much on class, but more on race. And you have these kind of race, these movements are based on ethnicity, like African American movement, obviously Chicano movement, Asian American movement, right? This is not race, but we have gay movements addressing their rights and women's movement addressing their rights too. So they begin to focus on things that impact a particular group, right? For many, it's race as the major issue that still haunts America to this day. So I'll have you. Last point here is that now these movements, again, nothing comes out of a vacuum, but they're part of a larger movement, right? Whether it be this new generation of our presidents, such as JFK, who gives hope to America. We see that with Obama, right? For many people, Obama, whether you liked him or didn't, it was a very defining moment in American history. So JFK kind of represented that same idea. It's a major shift, and it's part of this, not only having a Catholic president or a Black president, but people who are going to uplift different communities, and not because of their association with him, right? But because they believe in the concept of America, that you can actually help people and uplift them into something more. And that's why this new generation kind of looks up to people like Obama and people like JFK. So I'm going to have you all do an activity. I hope you enjoy it. The instructions will be posted, and you'll look at a particular Chicano organization, Chicana organization. You don't have to agree with the politics. The activity allows you to disagree with them. Maybe they're too radical for you. Maybe you follow more the politics of accommodation. That's fine. But, it's just a list of questions. I want you to write it as a letter, like you're writing a letter to somebody, like, hello, mom and dad. I'm here in LA, and you kind of met all these people and blah, 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 right? So don't answer it as questions, but rather as a narrative. And let you explore some of these different movements of the Chicano movement, okay? So I'll stop it there, and this will be the end of basically the history. From this point forward, we're going to focus more on different themes. So we'll talk about sexuality, we'll talk about films, we'll talk about culture, and this kind of ends the historical kind of linear progression that we started with from the beginning of the semester. All right, so we'll stop it there.